Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. With the help of President Clinton and Jordan's ailing King Hussein, Israeli and Palestinian leaders recently brokered an agreement at Wye Mills, Maryland. But was it a major step toward peace, or did it merely postpone the tough decisions? Joining us to sort through the conflict and consensus are Richard Haass, the former Senior Director for the Near East at the National Security Council, and currently the Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. He is the author of The Reluctant Sheriff, the United States After the Cold War. And Michael Hudson, Professor of International Relations and Arab Studies at Georgetown University. He is the editor of the forthcoming book, Middle East Dilemma. The topic before the House, what next in the Middle East? This week on Think Tank. The recent accord between the Israelis and Palestinians occurred after 9 days of contentious negotiations. Among the many provisions, Israel agreed to give up another 13% of the West Bank to the Palestinians for partial self-rule, giving the Palestinians more control of what is already a bizarre jigsaw puzzle of territory. For the time being, Israel will still control 60% of the West Bank. Israel has also promised to release 750 prisoners from its jails. In return, the Palestinians once again agreed to revoke all the paragraphs in its charter that call for the destruction of the State of Israel. The Palestinians also pledged to take several steps designed to crack down on terrorist activity. These include turning terrorists over to Israel and the confiscation of weapons. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency would monitor this process, a controversial step. The White House claimed a major foreign policy victory at Wye Mills, but Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Yasser Arafat must still deal with hardliners in their respective camps. Already there has been trouble on both sides. Moreover, the agreement leaves in abeyance the most intractable issues, among them final borders, the status of Jerusalem, and the question of Palestinian statehood. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on Think Tank. Richard, let's begin with you. The White House claims that the agreement at Wye Mills was a historic breakthrough. Do you see it that way?
No, I think it was a useful step forward. A football analogy might be, Ben, that it went several yards down the field. It's no more and no less than that. The key, as you yourself suggested, is first of all how it's implemented. There's a big difference between what you agree to sitting out at Wye Plantation and then what actually happens on the ground. And secondly, what comes after. Again, as you correctly said, most of the big issues in the Middle East were not tackled. So what this does is essentially moves us a little bit forward and allows us to live to fight for another day, or better yet, hopefully not fight another day.
Michael?
I think Richard's absolutely right. The peace process was like a patient that had suffered cardiac arrest, and the Wye operation is like CPR. So the patient is revived, but is still very sick. And so far, I think we're right to be quite pessimistic. This agreement, actually, all of these small provisions should have been accomplished many months ago. So we're just playing catch up, and I think there's been enormous hype on the part of the administration trumpeting this as something rather more than it actually is.
Well, there is one semi-conspiratorial train of thought going on in Washington that this was sort of a wag the dog scenario to help Clinton bail himself out of a difficult domestic situation. Did that play any role in it, in your judgment?
Look, if domestic politics played no role in this, Bill Clinton would then be the first president whose foreign policy had no relationship to domestic policy. So you've got to assume it had some role. But I also think it's fair to point out the foreign policy rationales. Clearly, these people were worried. They were all looking ahead to next May. May 4th, 1999 is the day chosen by which the entire Middle East agreement is meant to have been negotiated. Now, everybody knows there's no chance, but what everyone's really worried about is
That includes the tough stuff, Jerusalem, final borders, everything.
the whole ball of wax. And what everyone's worried about is as we approach next May, Palestinians will just start taking matters into their own hands, say, for example, declaring an independent state. Israelis will then react and, for example, perhaps annex a lot of territory. So the administration was justifiably spooked by this prospect. And I think that, more than anything else, essentially got them on their bicycle and said, we've got to take the risk, we've got to bring them out to Wye, we've got to get enough progress, not to solve this, but at least to give people the confidence that negotiations still have some potential.
At these kind of conferences where people stay together for hour after hour, day after day, in this case, longer than a week, I guess, does a certain dynamic take over on its own, that the spirit changes and they all say nice things about each other, and does it carry over?
Well, I think there may have been a little bit of that, and certainly the body language at the signing ceremony indicated a degree of, not warmth exactly, but at least minimum civility between Netanyahu and Arafat. So that probably works to some extent, but I must say the dominant image I have from this is that the Palestinian and Israeli delegations still retained a very large measure of distrust toward each other. And as soon as everybody went home, you began to see a bit of foot dragging, I think, on both sides.
I actually think there's a different dynamic also, which is the longer you stay out at a place like Wye, the more the stakes rise. It's like a poker game. The longer the hand goes on, the more the pot builds. And as a result, the longer the talks went on, the greater the stakes for Bill Clinton. He really didn't want things to fail. And the more that neither Bibi Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, or Yasser Arafat wanted to be blamed for everything unraveling. So in a funny sort of way, the longer it went on, the greater the stakes went, but also the more it really needed to succeed.
Did they agree to anything that wasn't in the original Oslo Accords?
No, I don't believe so. I think that they are basically following up on basic lines of agreement that were at least in principle accepted back in 1993 or in the subsequent follow-up agreements. And the two big ones, of course, were the security agreement, and they seem to have, worked out this thanks to the kind of mediating function that the CIA will serve, which is, I think, quite an accomplishment, although not without future risks.
You approve of the American CIA being involved on the ground in this?
No, I don't exactly approve of it. I think it's
You don't disapprove of it.
I think if you want to have an agreement, this may have been the only way to bridge the gap at that particular time, but frankly, I'm quite worried. I think Senator Shelby and others who follow intelligence matters do have a point that when you get out there, this is a region, I go there often, and I have a sense of just how tense and bitter the situation is. I think CIA agents that may be posted down in Jericho or in Gaza or Ramallah or wherever may find themselves targeted from both sides, and if things go badly, as they almost certainly will, they're going to be blamed.
Who will tell the story of the scorpion and the camel? Because if nobody will, you know the story of the scorpion and the camel?
You tell the story.
The story about the Middle East is that a scorpion seeks to cross the Nile, and he asks a camel if he would take him across. And the camel thinks, he says, this scorpion might bite me and I might die, but on the other hand, if I die, he'll die, so it's okay. So the scorpion gets on the camel's back, and they head across the Nile, and right in the middle, bang, the scorpion nails the camel, and the camel starts dying, and they both are going down. The camel says, idiot, scorpion, why did you bite me? You're going to die now also. And he said, this is the Middle East. Is this still the Middle East? Are we still in that kind of situation?
At the risk of disappointing you, that's really the $64,000 question. What we don't know is this simply more of the same? Are we about to see each side, now that they've gone home from Wye, look to kill it in the implementation? Or are they going to look to drag their feet? That's possible. I think the most interesting question now is what happens with Israeli politics. Bibi Netanyahu has headed a center-right coalition. By agreeing to what he agreed to at Wye, he clearly tilted in the direction of the center rather than the right. And the question is, does he continue? Ultimately, do we see a realignment of Israeli politics, which would suggest Israel is committed to making a peace process work on terms that the Palestinians could be expected to accept?
Netanyahu ran on that proposition that he didn't like Oslo, but he would go along with Oslo, but just be tougher than Shimon Peres was.
That's exactly right. He was going to be a tougher, more successful negotiator, so he was going to get a greater chunk of security with peace. That was Bibi Netanyahu's standard. At Wye, he seemed to meet that, and clearly he's alienated people to his right. The real question is, does he now try to tack back, using a sailing metaphor, in the implementation and once again ingratiate himself with his right, or has he now embarked once and for all on a more centrist path, and which ultimately would force a whole realignment of Israeli politics? I don't know the answer to that question, but that's what we're going to find out.
But Bibi is a preeminent tactician, so I think wouldn't be surprising if, in fact, he does tack back. He's got more trouble than I think he bargained for, even within his own cabinet. And even though the Labour Party has given him a temporary safety net so that he doesn't have to face a confidence vote that he would lose, that's only temporary. And I think really the more serious problem, and it's serious in an almost sort of physical security way as well as a political way, is coming from the settler movement in the occupied territories. Netanyahu, I think, is already and rightly beefing up his personal security because people are beginning to remember that the rhetoric that is being directed against him is similar to that had been directed against Yitzhak Rabin just before his assassination by a Jewish extremist.
And Anwar Sadat before that. There's a lot of scorpions and a lot of camels out there.
As you said, it's the Middle East. The one thing you know for sure is whenever people start getting busy at the negotiating table, people also start getting busy in the street with bombs.
Look, the argument that the Israeli hawks make is that this lands for peace center beam of the whole negotiation is in itself flawed. They say, we give back the land is there, they promise peace, they give us peace for a day, a week, a month, or a year, and then they ratchet up the stakes, no more peace, terrorism, they already have the land, they want more land. Is that not a plausible position for the Israelis to take? It's a small state.
There's an inherent unevenness or inequality in what people bring to the table. The currency that Israel does hold is territory, more than anything else. What the Palestinians offer is peace and security for Israel. So you're trading apples and oranges here. What you've got to do then, if you're the Israelis, is structure it so any arrangement, any peace agreement happens in phases. So you're not trusting a lot, but basically you do it piece by piece by piece, and you see what you get.
But then you can more easily renege on the peace part than you can on the land part.
But you have specific requirements. It's interesting. The whole idea of reciprocity or conditionality is clearly built into this. Michael was right. This is not so much new, but it is a refinement of Oslo. And the idea that the Palestinians simply can't promise, once again, for example, to change their covenant, but they actually have to deliver in very explicit ways, tells you something. The Israelis are going to hold off certain transfers of territory until the Palestinians have actually taken, rather than just promised to take certain steps.
Yeah, but there's a question of another kind of imbalance. There's a huge imbalance of power between Israel and the Palestinians. And there's also a question, if you're asking about how much peace, that's what the Israelis ask, how much peace, how much security. The Palestinians are asking how much land and what kind of land. And is that land contiguous so that Palestinians can go from one town to another without being stopped at checkpoints and getting harassed and so forth? And I think the thing that I find problematic about the whole Oslo formula, and certainly the way it's been implemented so far in a very niggardly manner, is that this imbalance in land, the land deficit, makes the Palestinians, it's very difficult for Arafat, despite all the control and the prestige that he exercises, to accept a formula that looks like a Swiss cheese to the Palestinians. The Swiss cheese model, or the leopard spot model, is little bits of Bantustans. And Bantustans that's the word that's going around in the Palestinian debate after the Wye Mills.
Richard, when you were in the National Security Council in the Bush administration, did you negotiate face-to-face with Arafat? Have you met him?
I have not at that time, because we didn't have those kinds of relations, but I've met him subsequently.
What is the book on him? Is he regarded as a trustworthy partner in this deal, or don't we know? Or do we think not?
I think the jury's out on that. Clearly, everything's relative in life, and in the Arab camp or the Palestinian camp, he clearly represents a more moderate tendency, but he clearly has a whole legacy which is less than that. And even now, he doesn't always deliver on what he promises, and there's often a distinction between what he says to us and what he says to his own people. I think, again, there are those in Israel who are understandably skeptical, and it's almost like Ronald Reagan used to say, trust but verify. I think that's where we are in Israeli politics, which is why you've structured this process that it's so conditional. We'll only do X if you do Y.
Arafat's a fascinating character. I met him last March in Gaza, and I've seen him over the years in various places. And one thing that one might add to this is that he is physically a lot more frail than he used to be. He looked to me rather shrunken compared to previous times. He would be in his 60s, I guess, late 60s.
Mm-hmm. You hear a lot of stories that his health is failing, Parkinson's,
well,
things
yeah,
like that.
The trembling lip and so forth. But I think more serious than that are reports that he's been very depressed. Now, when Arafat gets depressed, it's not like the Prime Minister of Norway. When he gets depressed, he can go off and have a little vacation and everybody's happy. But because Arafat micromanages the Palestinian political arena so much, it's a bit worrisome.
Also, not only that, but he has a legitimacy and a persona within the Palestinian community that no one will ever be able to replace. He's the founder. And in a funny sort of way, if the Israelis want to strike a deal, much better to do it now, because Arafat will probably have greater capacity to sell a deal to his own community, to his own people, than anyone who's likely to come in his wake, who's simply not going to have the same political strength.
It's really amazing. Despite all of the failings of Arafat to deliver through the Oslo process, the public opinion polls among Palestinians still put him way up there, despite all of the abuses and all of the corruption.
But failed to deliver to the Palestinians because the Israelis say he failed to deliver to the Israelis. I mean, because they gave up some land and the terrorism accelerated.
Most Palestinians are very disappointed, of course, with the way the peace process has gone, and yet Arafat retains this kind of personal legitimacy that goes back, to a sort of historic role that he has played. He's kind of a father figure. They called him Abu Ammar, which is father of Ammar.
In the last, say, 15 years or so, the Soviet Union has disappeared, which was the principal benefactor of the anti-Israeli Arab states. There's been a incredible decline in the price of oil, which really diminishes the basic Arab economic situation. There has been a huge influx of Russian Jews into Israel, which was unexpected, a big demographic, intellectual, high-tech bonus. The Israel economy has sort of taken off. We were in Egypt recently. We did some think tank shows there. That economy is beginning to move. It's growing at 5 or 6% a year, not subject to the aging contagion, apparently. Is it possible that this whole, and Egypt is the big guy in the block, and Israel is now not such a small player. It's got 6 million people. Is it possible that that whole area is about ready to take off?
Well, we certainly thought so 5 years ago. But there's a downside to lower oil prices, and generally, with the exception of Egypt, there's a fair amount of economic stagnation, which can create political tensions and unrest. That's why our friends in Egypt and Jordan, Saudi Arabia, have been so anxious for the Oslo process to succeed, because there's enough kind of free-floating unhappiness out there for all of these economic and demographic reasons to make governments in power rather worried about yet another outbreak of Palestinian-Israeli hostility.
I'm quite bearish on it. The Middle East not only missed a lot of the Industrial Revolution, it's really missed a lot of the Information Revolution. This is not a region, in any real sense of the word, there's no trade, there's no movement. It's not poised to take off. The education levels are bad.
Israel and Egypt together could make a block.
But even within Egypt, a large chunk of that population, which by the way increases 1 million every 8 months, a large part of the Egyptian population is not participating in the growth that you just talked about. Lots of women in the Middle East are not educated, are not participating. This part of the world has really missed a lot of the progress, the political and economic progress of the last few years. I don't see it as somehow ready to become a positive place in the world.
Well, I would qualify that a little bit. I think the problem is there has been in fact, some considerable spread of education. The information revolution actually is beginning to take hold there. But the problem is there's not enough, and there's not been any real sort of dividend from these advances. That's why I think there's a political malaise.
One of the great historic figures there were two in my judgment, King Hussein and General Ariel Sharon, who's a great military hero and very controversial in Israel and outside of Israel. Sharon has made the statement, and I guess a lot of other people have, that there will not be real peace in the area until the Arab countries become democracies. That parse?
Well, that is the view, and not just Sharon, it's a broader view that you can't trust agreements negotiated by autocrats because it's too brittle. And if the autocrat changes his mind, The peace is not institutionalized. It doesn't put down roots. That said, you had an Egyptian-Israeli peace, which is an example of a peace between a democracy and an autocracy, and same thing with Jordan. Jordan, while it has parliamentary life, is not a democracy. If Israel waits until democracy is in full flower in the Arab world, it's going to be waiting a couple of generations at best. I think the more realistic choice for Israel is to negotiate, if not full peace agreements, clearly non-belligerency agreements with its neighbors, and then to structure them in ways that it's clearly remains strong physically and militarily.
But you know, this proposition depends on an assumption that people basically want peace. And I'm not quite so sure that's true in Arab public opinion. There was a time, we've forgotten it now, but back in the late 40s and 50s when a number of Arab countries near Israel did have parliamentary systems and elections that did not diminish their hostility toward Israel. But I think
that, in fact, is when they invaded Israel in 48.
Well, you know, it's a complicated story. But if we come,
Okay.
and I won't go into it,
Right.
but if we come up to the present situation, one wonders if it wouldn't just be an awful lot easier from a diplomatic point of view if everybody was a dictator and they could just work it out in a kind of a higher rational way. Now, if Jordan had more democracy than it has, it would be even tougher.
It would be Algeria.
It'd be tougher to sustain a peace treaty with Israel. And if the Palestinian population had a little more political freedom, who is to say that under the present circumstances you wouldn't have actually a more hardline kind of government in power?
All right, let's conclude with a question to each of you. A look ahead to May 4th is the next key date, and then look ahead 5 years beyond that. And guess, I can't ask you to predict or project because it is the Middle East, but Michael, starting with you, what do you think is going to go on?
Well, let me be characteristically gloomy about this. I think there are a lot of problems in getting even the Wye agreements under implementation. And if there's been a lot of foot dragging and not much has happened by May 4th, I think Arafat will declare the state, even though he declared the state back in 1988, everybody's forgotten that, but he will declare it. There will be a diplomatic crisis, and very possibly we will see the worst case scenario, which is a sort of general kind of armed conflict and uprising between mutinying Palestinian security forces and Israeli forces, a kind of a broader intifada. And that is, you know, with that, it's hard to predict what things will be like, you know, 5 years hence.
Well, with that very optimistic view, Richard, what do you think?
I won't try to outgloom my colleague here. Let me give you at least the potential, what the positive scenario would look like, but also one that's not wildly out of the question. You would have a stumbling but still progressive implementation of what was just agreed to at Wye, taking longer than 3 months. You'll have the beginning of final status talks, meant to begin November 2nd. And by the time we get up to May 4th, zero chance on the earth that all this is negotiated, but enough progress by, say, May 3rd that Yasser Arafat can stand out and say, I'm not going to declare an independent state because I still think negotiations have the potential to deliver. And what we're then into is a long phase of final status talks. You could then have elections in Israel ultimately to decide what Israel is going to do, because that would be the basic issue. The United States could weigh in and try to shape the process. So I think it's too soon, if you will, to rule out the chance that this may work in a very halting, stumbling fashion. We're just not there yet. What it's going to take, though, are changes in Israel's politics, Mr. Arafat keeping his word, and the United States essentially staying involved. It's not enough just to be involved for 9 days at Wye.
Absolutely.
We are going to need regular, not just private, but public involvement in this process. Israelis and Palestinians can no longer make peace by themselves. The United States needs to be the third party.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael and Richard, and thank you for Think Tank. I'm Ben Wattenberg.
We at Think Tank depend on your views to make our show better. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036, or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about Think Tank, visit PBS online at www.pbs.org. And please let us know where you watch Think Tank. This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.